Hi guys! Today I'm going to be going over how I managed to implement throwing a test tube in our game. Moving forward, we might end up adding other thrown projectiles, but this is what we're starting with because it fits the best with, we think, the theme of the game. And I feel like it wouldn't be too weird for the idea of like grabbing a test tube in a hospital, so I think it really works. So first, let me show the final result. Basically, right now, I can go up to this patient and press E, and I'll receive a test tube. I don't have anything to like indicate that I've done that yet because I still have to implement an inventory system. And then you can click, and the test tube will fly out at the location that you clicked at. So if we run this again, because right now I only have us set up to do one at a time, we can click there and it happens. And on impact, it plays a glass breaking animation that will remain there. And yeah, so that's what we have right now. So the way that I've set this up is basically kind of mashing together two different tutorials that I found on YouTube to do it, and I'll link them in the description in case they're helpful. They definitely were for me. But we have a rigid body 2D that's our test tube with this sprite that's a sprite sheet. And basically, we have one animation player set up with just the glass breaking animation. And if we go to the code here, you'll see that in the actual test tube script, there's not a lot going on. This is just basically a signal from the collision shape that's saying that if it's collided, and I'm using a state to on top of the like built-in signal for collision, but that's only because I was having some problems when the test tube had done the braking animation and it was supposed to stop, that it was like floating around and still continued to have velocity. So otherwise I wouldn't have added a state on top of the like built-in signal, but basically this allows me to call that state in the process to just permanently anchor it at the position that it was immediately when it collided, which is what resting pause is there to do as well. If it hasn't collided yet, we record the resting position, we play the braking animation, we disable the collision shape because we don't want any of our other test tubes to collide with it when they're thrown, or the player to collide with it. And then we set has collided to be true. So in the process, it just keeps the test tube where it is. So that's all that's in the test tube itself. It's really in the player script that all of the like throwing stuff, all the code to manage that is. And then I've created a separate scene that's the test tube that I'm preloading in the code for the player, so that when we have this if statement, that when you click and you can fire, which is a Boolean variable that I've currently set to true, and then if the global script.tube count is greater than 0, which is basically I have a singleton called global script where I've stored a bunch of other global variables, and I have something called tube count that's going to keep track of how many test tubes the player has, so if they can throw them. And so if all of those things line up, we're going to instance a new instance of test tube called instance tube. And then basically this is a node 2D that I've set up with the player. And one of the tutorials that I'll link below was that one that gave me this idea. But basically it's a node 2D at the position of the player, and then a position 2D that sits a little bit away from the player and can rotate around, hinged on the node 2D that's centered on the player. And what that's going to allow us to do is to have the node 2D look at our global mouse position. So if we go here, like, and my mouse position's here, like, it's going to shift to look at the mouse position, which is going to shift this position 2D to be, like, in a line to our mouse position, which is going to be helpful to allow us to like click and spawn a test tube in the direction that we click, which is how I wanted it to work. I didn't just want you to like have to throw in up or to the sides or down. And then we set the test tube position to be the position of the position 2D, which is a little bit away from the player, so it doesn't spawn immediately on the player. And I'm setting the Z index just to manage the ultimate collision with the wall, so that the glass breaking is drawn behind the wall in the part that goes behind the wall. Otherwise, it would come in front, and that would look a little weird. And then we're using the apply impulse function, which is for rigid bodies, and this is the offset. I don't really understand how this works, but basically it's applying impulse to a rigid body 2D. I don't really know what the vector is, but this is just an empty vector 2. This is our tube speed with a y-axis of 0, and then we're just going to rotate it to the rotation of the node 2D. So we don't have to enter a y-axis, and that will give us the same speed each time, but just like rotated along to be the position of the mouse, because we have the node 2D looking at the mouse position, so the rotation will be the same as the mouse position. Because there's no way to just like directly be like, what's the angle of the global mouse position, because they're like in relation to what? And that's what the node 2D does, because the node 2D gives us like the rotation relative to the player's position towards the global mouse position. And then we just add the child of the tube, and this allows us to do multiple. You can instance it like a million times. Well, not a million times a second, but that'll like break the game. But yeah, you can do multiple instances. And then we have a little timer set up, so if you had multiple test tubes, you couldn't fire them all at once because that would look bad. So we have a timer of like 0.5 seconds to allow a little bit of like lag in between when you can fire. But yeah, so that's all the code that's in the protagonist itself. I kind of thought that this was like really complicated at first, but this actually isn't a lot of lines of code, I feel like, for doing something like this. And like I said, the tutorials were really, really helpful, so I recommend you check those out. I'm kind of just copying what they're doing and tailoring it to what I'm trying to do specifically. But yeah, what I think is next is to add a really basic inventory system to manage, like, you don't just want to like click and have nothing happen and guess that you just got a test tube. Obviously that won't happen, but that'll be a UI down here or something. I don't know, haven't really figured that out. But yeah, so this will hopefully tie in like in the future in the game. They'll be potentially used as a weapon against enemies, and or like throwing things will potentially be involved with like traps or things like that, so it's kind of helpful moving forward. But yeah, that's how I've set up throwing a test tube in my game. This was just one specific thing that I'd done that I was kind of proud of, and I was excited to show it off. So I hope you like it. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe.